Powerful businessman fires black employee after discovering she is pregnant. Years later, the businessman has his world turned upside down when a black man walks into his company and calls him dad. Sarah Washington entered the huge room with hesitant steps. The heels of her shoes echoed on the cold marble floor, while the weight of the situation made each movement seem slower, heavier. She felt her throat tighten and her stomach clench. It was as if the whole environment was conspiring against her. That room, with its glass walls and expensive furniture, was a world that didn't belong to her. It never had. Sitting in that leather chair, facing Michael Roberts' mahogany desk, she felt out of place, displaced. Michael, however, was immersed in papers, reviewing contracts, signing documents, as if Sarah's presence there was nothing more than an annoying interruption. He didn't raise his eyes, and the sound of his pen scratching the paper made the silence even more unbearable. Sarah stared at her own hands in a cold sweat, her nails ruined from biting them over the last few days. She had spent sleepless nights thinking about how to say that to him, rehearsal after rehearsal in front of the mirror. But now, standing there in front of him, everything seemed wrong. Michael always had that effect on her, the ability to make anything seem insignificant, including her feelings. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the room was closing in around her. Finally, Michael put down his pen with a soft sigh and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He looked at her with that cold, distant gaze that had so often made her feel small. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She needed to speak. She needed to break that crushing silence. But the words which had once seemed so clear were now stuck in her throat. "Michael, she began, but her voice came out weak, almost inaudible. She stopped and swallowed, trying to gain strength. Her eyes sought his, but Michael was calm, waiting, without a hint of emotion on his face. She took a deep breath and, with all the effort she could muster, finally let it out. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face didn't change. He just blinked slowly, as if the information was an irrelevant detail, something of no importance. For a few seconds, Sarah wondered if he had even heard. Her heart raced in her chest and her hands trembled in her lap, while Michael's gaze remained calm, impassive. It was as if she hadn't said anything. She expected some kind of reaction, shock, anger, anything. But what came was a simple, almost robotic, "I understand." And that was it. No more questions, no hesitation. Those empty words echoed in her mind like a punch in the gut. Her world, which was already falling apart, collapsed even faster. Michael sighed as if that conversation was taking valuable time out of his day. "You should have been more careful." His tone was icy, like someone dealing with an administrative problem, not a human life that was about to begin. Sarah felt her face heat up with shame and humiliation. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words were lost. The promises murmured during those hidden nights, the smiles shared in the dark. It all seemed like a farce, something she herself had invented. "I thought you should know," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady but failing miserably. "It's yours." Michael leaned his elbows on the table and brought his fingertips together, his eyes finally meeting hers. "That's unfortunate." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The coldness in Michael's words hit her harder than any scream could have done. The nights of fear and uncertainty she had faced alone seemed ridiculous now. She had been a fool. And now there she was, crumbling in front of a man who didn't even seem to have the capacity to care. "Michael, I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice breaking. Michael got up from his chair and walked around the table, stopping in front of her. He didn't touch her or try to console her. He just looked down like someone observing a problem for which there is no simple solution. "I can't be part of this, Sarah. You know that." His voice was firm but without passion. "I have a family. I have a name to live up to." Sarah's world stopped. The air seemed to be missing. He really was abandoning her, just like that, without a shred of remorse. She stood up suddenly, her whole body shaking, but Michael had already made up his mind. "I suggest you leave that behind too," he said, turning back to the table. "By the way, this will be your last week here. I've already spoken to HR." Sarah's legs almost gave way. She was being dismissed. Dismissed. It wasn't just the father of her child who was leaving her. It was her boss, the man who had the power to take away everything she had built up over the last few years, and he was doing it without even blinking. Her eyes stung, but she wasn't going to cry there, not in front of him. With a newfound coolness, Sarah left the room without looking back, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the collapsing world. She walked down the elevator, feeling the tears threaten to fall, but she held back. The crushing reality of being alone, pregnant, and unemployed began to settle deep into her soul. She was destroyed, but she knew one thing. She still had her son. And for him, she would fight, even if she had to face hell. Sarah left Michael's room as if someone had pulled the floor out from under her feet. The corridor seemed longer, the walls narrower, and with every step she took, the feeling of abandonment grew inside her. All she could think was, how could he just turn his back like that? As she entered the elevator, she felt her legs almost fail her, but she kept her head up, clutching her bag against her body as if it were a shield. She was on automatic, her eyes fixed on the metal door, unable to see anything around her. His words. That's unfortunate. As if what they were experiencing was a minor inconvenience, something he could simply sweep under the carpet. The truth, which she already knew deep down but didn't want to admit, finally hit. She had never been important to him. Everything they'd experienced, all those nights she'd thought were meaningful, nothing. And now, pregnant, without a job, she was more alone than ever. Those promises whispered in the dark were nothing but empty words. She had been a mistake, a problem to be solved, and quickly. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold wind hit her face, and that's when the tears finally came. She tried to fight them back, but the lump in her throat was impossible to hold back. The cry came out heavy, her body shaking with a mixture of sadness, anger, and humiliation. At that moment, Sarah felt completely invisible in the middle of the city. People rushed past her, too busy to notice the despair of a woman whose world had just fallen apart. She walked aimlessly for a few blocks, her shoes hurting her feet, but none of that mattered. It was hard to think clearly about the future, hard to imagine how she would survive the next few months without the job she so desperately needed. Every step she took seemed to lead deeper into the hole. But then, amidst the chaos of thoughts, she put her hand to her stomach. There, right there, was the only thing that still made sense. She stopped walking, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She looked around, trying to pull herself together. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing in her life had ever been easy. And with Michael throwing everything they had, or what she thought they had, in the garbage can, she knew it would be even harder now. But Sarah also knew one thing. She wasn't going to give up. Not this time. With her eyes still swollen and her heart crushed, she took a deep breath. Michael could have abandoned her, ignored the responsibility of being a father, but she wasn't going to give in. The strength she needed, even if it was still hidden somewhere inside her, would come out. If not for herself, then for the baby she was carrying. For him, she would fight to the end. And so Sarah walked into the unknown, more alone than she had ever been, but with a new kind of determination burning deep inside. She knew the road would be long, painful, but the only certainty she had was that somehow she and her son would survive. She had no choice. Terrell woke up before sunrise that day, his body full of nervous energy. It was the kind of feeling that came when something big was about to happen, as if the whole world stood still for a second, waiting to see what he would do. He looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie for the fourth time. The new suit, which he had bought by saving up for months, looked good on him. Everything had to be perfect. It was the first day at the most important job of his life, Collins Associates. This job was what he and his mother, Sarah, had dreamed of for years. He knew that this was the chance to change their lives for good. Growing up without a father, watching his mother struggle to put food on the table, made Tyrell understand from an early age that nothing would come easy for him. And today was the day to start building the future he had promised Sarah so much. On the way to the kitchen, the familiar smell of tea filled the air. His mother was already there, sitting at the table with a mug in her hands, her face half lit by the dim morning light. When Terrell entered, she smiled, but it was a restrained smile, different from the enthusiasm he had expected. It made him pause for a second. How do I look? Terrell asked, trying to break the awkward mood as he spun around to show off his suit. You look great, son, she replied, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Terrell pulled up a chair and sat down in front of her. He knew that expression. It was concern, disguised as pride. Mom, what's wrong? You don't look very happy about this. Sarah sighed, clutching her mug as if trying to draw strength from the warmth of the tea. It's just this place. Collins Associates. I don't know if it's what you think it is. She avoided his eyes, fixing her gaze on the table. That took Terrell by surprise. She had always been his biggest supporter, always told him he could achieve anything he wanted. But now on the most important day of his life, she seemed hesitant, almost afraid. Do you know anyone who worked there? He asked, trying to understand the reason for this sudden concern. Sarah shook her head, but didn't answer immediately. Terrell saw her hands grip the mug tighter. Something was wrong. He could feel it, but Sarah didn't want to say what it was. Ty, just promise me you'll be careful, okay? She said, finally looking at him. There was something deeper in that look, as if she knew something he didn't. He frowned. He frowned. Mom, you were so excited when I got the job. What's changed? The silence that followed was suffocating, full of unspoken things. Sarah looked down at her tea, took a deep breath, and then let the words out in a whisper. Some places have shadows, son. Things you don't see until it's too late. Terrell sat still for a moment, trying to understand what she meant. She always spoke in metaphors when she was scared or afraid of something, but now it didn't make sense. It was just a job, an opportunity that he had worked so hard to get. He was no longer a child. He knew what he was doing. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. I'll be fine, I promise. She smiled, but her gaze was still distant, lost in memories he couldn't reach. After a final sip of tea, Terrell said goodbye and walked out the door, the cold morning wind whipping his face. He shook his head, trying to put the strange conversation with his mother behind him. This was his day. Nothing was going to take that away from him. The subway was crowded, but Terrell barely noticed the people around him. His thoughts were ahead, on the future he was going to build. Collins Associates was the top of the market. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to face whatever came. Or so he thought. When he arrived in front of the Collins building, he stopped for a second to look at the imposing glass building, which reflected the morning sun like a symbol of success. He took a deep breath. This was it, where it all began. Inside, the frenetic movement of people and the formal atmosphere was almost overwhelming. He was greeted by his supervisor, Mrs. Robinson, a serious woman with watchful eyes and quick steps. Welcome, Terrell, she said without wasting time on ceremony. We expect great things from you. Her words were full of expectation, and that made his heart beat faster. As she led him through the corridors, Terrell took in everything around him. It was a dream environment, important people everywhere, cutting-edge technology, a well-oiled machine of business and success. But there was something in the air, an invisible tension that he couldn't explain. As they passed a glass-walled meeting room, Tyrell briefly saw the man who ran it all, Michael Roberts. He was surrounded by executives, his posture imposing and controlled. And then, for a split second, Michael's eyes met Tyrell's. An instant. It was quick, but long enough for something strange to happen. Terrell felt a shiver run up his spine. It wasn't just because Michael was so imposing. There was something else in that look, something he couldn't identify, but which made his heart beat a little faster. But as always, he pushed the feeling away. It must have been nerves. First day, a lot on his mind. That was it. It couldn't be anything else. As he went through the routine of the first day, that strange feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. But Terrell forced himself to focus on what mattered. He was there to work, to prove his worth. The rest could wait. But deep down, he knew that something wasn't right. Terrell could barely sleep that night. Something about the look in Michael Roberts' eyes on his first day kept bothering him. There was something familiar about the man, something he couldn't explain. His mother's words were also echoing in his head. Some places have shadows. What did she mean by that? And why did she look so strange when he mentioned his new job? Lying in the dark, his mind spinning, he decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, the feeling that something was being hidden by his mother was stronger than ever. When he finally decided to confront her, the atmosphere in the house seemed heavier than usual. His mother was quiet, fiddling with the stove, but Terrell sensed that she knew what was coming. He sat at the table watching her for a moment, searching for the right words. She had been through a lot. He knew that. Raising a child on her own, with no support, working at anything she could find after being made redundant years ago. He respected her too much, but now he needed to know the truth. There was something big she wasn't telling him. "Mom, why were you so worried about my new job? Did you know anyone who worked there?" he asked, trying to sound calm, but the tension in his voice was impossible to hide. Sarah paused for a moment, her body tense, and she didn't answer right away. Terrell felt his stomach lurch. Something was definitely wrong. She continued stirring the pot, the silence stretching longer than was comfortable. "Mom," he insisted, now more firmly. She stopped pretending to be busy and finally turned around, her eyes full of something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just worry, it was pain. Old pain, which she had been hiding for a long time. "Tyrell, there's something I should have told you a long time ago," Sarah began, her voice trembling, each word seeming to weigh tons. He said nothing, just stared, his heart beating faster with each passing second. She swallowed, slowly sitting down at the table, the tension in the air almost suffocating. "The man you work for, Michael Roberts, he's not just your boss." Terrell felt a shiver run down his spine, but he stood there frozen, waiting for her to continue. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "Michael, he's your father." Terrell's world stopped. For a moment, he thought he hadn't understood correctly. His father? The man he had seen as a powerful, unreachable boss, the one who had never even exchanged a word with him, was his father? "What do you mean?" he muttered, his mind spinning in all directions. His chest felt heavy, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Everything he knew about his life suddenly seemed like a lie. Sarah lowered her head, clasping her hands together, the words coming out with difficulty. "When I worked for him years ago, we had an affair. I thought he cared, but when I told him I was pregnant with you, he sent me away. He fired me. He never looked back." Her words fell on Tyrell like a blow. He had always wanted to know who his father was, imagining different stories, inventing scenarios where he might have a good reason for not being there. But the truth was infinitely worse than he could have imagined. His father had not only abandoned him, but destroyed his mother's life in the process. "And you never said anything to me?" Terrell asked, his voice beginning to shake with anger and confusion. He stood up abruptly from his chair, unable to remain still. "You let me grow up without knowing who he was, without knowing the truth?" Sarah began to cry silently, but Terrell could feel nothing but anger. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want you to know what kind of man he is. I did the best I could, Terrell." He felt anger growing inside him, mixed with a pain he didn't know how to deal with. He had been deceived all his life. While he and his mother struggled to survive, Michael Roberts was there, living as if they had never existed. The same man he had admired, the powerful boss, was actually the man who had abandoned them, left them in misery. Terrell took a deep breath, trying not to explode, but the feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. "You should have told me, Mother. I had a right to know who he was." Sarah looked at him with eyes full of regret, but Tyrell couldn't look at her the same way anymore. He left the room, his chest tight, not knowing where to go, what to do. But he knew one thing. He couldn't go on working for that man as if nothing had happened. The truth, so cruel and merciless, was now clear. Terrell knew what he had to do. Terrell paced back and forth in the small apartment, his whole body boiling with anger. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a mixture of shock and fury that he couldn't control. Michael Roberts, the man he admired from afar, who ran that empire with unquestionable authority, was the same man who had ruined his mother's life and abandoned him before he was even born. His own father. Resentment burned inside him like a flame that wouldn't go out. How could someone just erase the past like that? Live life as if nothing had happened? Terrell could hardly believe that he had spent all that time in the same company, under the same roof as that man. with no idea who he really was. Now that he knew, it was as if everything he thought about his future, about his job, was crumbling in his hands. He knew he couldn't just let it go. Working for Michael Roberts, knowing who he was, knowing what he had done to his mother, was impossible. But at the same time, he couldn't just disappear. He needed to face the man who had destroyed his family. He needed to see Michael's reaction when he learned that the son he had abandoned was right there, in his company, growing under his nose without him realizing it. But how could he do that? He couldn't just confront him in the office, with everyone around, in an environment controlled by Michael. No, he had to find a way to catch him off guard, to make him face the truth once and for all. It was then that he overheard his co-workers whispering about the dinner that Michael and his family were going to have that evening, at a fancy restaurant in the city center. A business and family gathering, they said. Terrell knew this was his chance. There, in a personal setting, outside Michael's bubble of control at the office, would be the perfect moment to make him face the consequences of his actions. The idea began to form in Terrell's head, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that it was the right thing to do. He would go to that restaurant. He would look Michael Roberts in the eye and tell him the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Terrell didn't just want justice. He wanted the man to feel the weight of what he had done. He wanted to see Michael's reaction when he realized that the past he had tried to bury had finally come back to haunt him. With the decision made, Terrell felt a wave of determination sweep away the anger. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there was too much risk involved. Michael was a powerful man with connections and money, and Terrell was nothing more than a newly hired employee. But he had one advantage: the truth. And the truth was something Michael could no longer ignore. As he prepared to leave, putting on a clean shirt and trying to stay calm, Terrell couldn't stop thinking about his mother. Everything she'd been through, the sacrifices she'd made, the nights she'd come home exhausted, without a penny in her pocket, and he was still a child. All those times he asked about his father, and she avoided the subject, probably to protect him from a truth she knew would hurt him deeply. Now, not only did he know the truth, but he was about to let Michael know the impact he had made. Terrell was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his mother, for all the battles she had faced alone. He left home determined, feeling the weight of anger still burning in his chest, but at the same time knowing that the justice he sought was getting closer. Today, Michael Roberts would have nowhere to run. Tyrell took the subway, the train rocking under his feet as he stared out the window, the lights of the city passing by in a blur. He tried to keep his nerves in place, but it was difficult. The anger was still there, boiling under the surface. And the more he thought about what he was going to say to Michael, the more he felt that everything was about to explode. When he arrived at the restaurant, the elegant facade, illuminated by the warm glow of the candlelight inside, seemed perfect for a rich and powerful family like the Roberts. Terrell stood outside for a moment, watching, feeling his heart race. Inside, Michael was probably laughing, telling stories, enjoying a family evening as if nothing had happened, as if Sarah and Terrell's lives had never existed. But that illusion was about to be shattered. Tyrell took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked through the door. Terrell felt his stomach turn as soon as he entered the restaurant. The atmosphere inside was very different from the life he and his mother knew. Low, soft lights reflected off the marble floor. The sound of hushed conversations filled the place. People spoke in quiet tones, laughed in harmony, and glasses of wine sparkled under the candlelight. Everything exuded wealth, power, and a tranquility that made him grit his teeth. He was in another world, a world that, by rights, he had never been privy to. His eyes quickly found Michael Roberts' desk. He was there, sitting comfortably, laughing with his family, as if the universe was in perfect order. Next to him was his wife, Claire, an elegantly dressed woman who seemed to radiate the perfect life of a wealthy wife. On the other side of the table was Elijah, the youngest son, a clear reflection of Michael, with the same arrogant posture, the same unwavering confidence. It was a propaganda scene, too perfect, and that only made Tyrell's hatred grow. While his mother worked until she had no strength left, while he grew up without a father, Michael was there, enjoying his life with total contempt for the past he left behind. Terrell walked over to the table. Each step seemed heavier than the last. He felt as if the ground was sinking beneath his feet, but his anger kept him firmly focused. When he got close, Michael saw him. For an instant, Michael's smile froze as if he had been taken by surprise. Terrell could see that look, the same look he had noticed on his first day at work. But at that moment, what had only been discomfort for Michael turned into real tension. The air around the table seemed to stop. Tyrell stood on the edge of the table, looking directly at Michael. He could feel Claire and Elijah's eyes on him, confused, not understanding what was going on. But the tension in the room was clear. Michael knew it. "Can I help you?" Michael finally asked, his voice low, but with a tone of controlled impatience. Tyrell clenched his fists at his sides. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. "I'm here for the same reason you are, Michael. Family." The table fell absolutely silent. Claire raised an eyebrow, confused. Elijah, who had seemed so sure of himself seconds ago, now looked at his father for answers. "Who's that, Michael?" Claire asked, her voice breaking the tranquility of the room. Michael took a deep breath, clearly irritated, trying to regain control of the situation. "He's an employee of the company, Claire. We'll sort this out in the office, Tyrell." The mention of his name caused visible shock in Claire and Elijah. Michael tried to remain calm, but it was clear to everyone that he was trying hard to keep up appearances. Tyrell wasn't going to let this chance slip away. "Employee?" Tyrell repeated, his voice low but charged with anger. He looked at Claire, then at Elijah, then back at Michael. "I'm more than an employee, Michael. I'm the son you abandoned." The words hit the table like a punch. Claire gasped, slumping back in her chair, her hands shaking as she covered her mouth, her eyes wide, trying to understand what was happening. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his father, anger beginning to mix with confusion. He looked at Terrell as if he were trying to put the pieces of a puzzle together. Michael, for his part, seemed to have been hit by a blow he never saw coming. His face paled, his posture, which had once been confident, now showed weakness. He opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. His eyes, which had always shown control and superiority, were now filled with a mixture of shame and defeat. "Michael?" Claire whispered, her eyes filled with tears, searching for some kind of explanation. Terrell took a step forward, feeling the anger still burning in his chest, but now mixed with something else. The satisfaction of finally seeing the truth brought down on the man who had ignored him for so long. "You knew. You knew from the start. You knew it when you saw me on my first day at work. But you didn't say anything, because it was easier to ignore me, wasn't it? Just like you ignored my mother when she needed it most?" Michael rubbed his temples, his expression of pain and embarrassment visible. His voice finally came out, hoarse and shaky. I did what I thought was right back then. I had a family, a career, and you left my mother alone, with nothing. She had what she wanted, and then she threw it away. And now I'm here, as proof of everything you tried to hide." Elijah, who had been silent until then, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Dad, is this true? Do you have another son?" The incredulity in his voice was obvious, but there was something else there. A hint of contempt. Claire, still shocked, couldn't take her eyes off Michael. She was shaking, as if the ground was crumbling beneath her. "Michael, how could you?" Michael Roberts, the man who always had answers for everything, was finally at a loss for words. He couldn't face his wife, or his son, let alone Terrell. The empire he had built on lies was crumbling, and now with the truth laid bare in front of him, there was no more control he could take back. Terrell didn't wait for more excuses. He said what needed to be said. Now Michael would have to deal with what was left of his family. With one last look, Tyrell turned and left the restaurant, feeling the weight of the truth finally lifted from his shoulders. The confrontation didn't bring relief, but it did bring certainty. Michael Roberts could never ignore the past again. When Tyrell left the restaurant, the cold of the night hit him hard, but he hardly felt it. His mind was spinning, as if the full weight of what had just happened was just beginning to settle in. He should have been satisfied, perhaps even relieved, but what he felt was an emptiness he hadn't expected. He walked aimlessly through the busy streets, his head down, trying to process what he had just done. For years he had dreamed of this moment, the chance to finally confront the man who had abandoned him, to look him in the eye and throw the whole truth back in his face. He thought it would bring some sense of justice, a moral victory, but now that the moment had passed, it all seemed pointless. Terrell stopped at a corner, leaning against a lamppost, trying to catch his breath. His heart was still beating fast in his chest, but it didn't feel like victory. It was as if he had won a battle, but lost something more important in the process. He rubbed his face with his hands, the sound of the city around him mixing with his own confused thoughts. What did he hope to achieve with this? That Michael would confess his mistakes and apologize? That he would magically change and try to make amends for the past? The truth is, as much as Terrell wanted to see that man suffer, nothing would bring back the years he and his mother had lost. Nothing would erase the pain of seeing his mother struggle alone while Michael went on with his life, protected by his wealth and position. As the lights of the cars passed him by, Terrell realized that the justice he sought was more complicated than simply exposing the truth. What would happen now? Michael would be forced to face reality, yes. But would that really change anything? His family was destroyed, of course, but that didn't change the fact that for years Michael had lived comfortably while his mother suffered. A sense of frustration began to replace him. The emptiness grew by the second, and Terrell couldn't escape the feeling that it had all been for nothing. His mother, Sarah, had fought so hard to keep him away from this kind of pain, and now he understood why. The truth didn't bring the relief he thought it would. Instead, it brought a new pain, a pain of realizing that nothing he could do or say would change the past. After some time standing there, Terrell decided that he couldn't go on wandering aimlessly. He took the subway back home, curling up on the seat as the train moved through the dark tunnels. He stared at his reflection in the glass, the image of an exhausted man who had faced his greatest fear, but didn't feel any stronger for it. He felt even more lost. When he arrived at the apartment, the familiar smell of home-cooked food hit him as soon as he opened the door. His mother, Sarah, was in the kitchen as usual, stirring something on the stove. The quiet sound of the pot boiling and the warmth of the house were a stark contrast to the cold he felt inside. Terrell stood for a second in the doorway, just watching. She still didn't know what he had done. She still didn't know that he had confronted Michael, that he had exposed the whole truth. She turned when she heard the sound of the door closing and smiled softly, but when she saw the expression on Tyrell's face, the smile disappeared. "How was it?" she asked, already knowing that something had happened. Terrell threw his coat on a chair and approached the table, sitting down heavily. "I did what you didn't want me to do. I confronted him." Sarah was silent, her gaze dropping as she rested her hands on the counter. She sighed deeply, as if she had expected this, but at the same time was preparing herself for what was to come. "And how was it?" she asked again, her voice low, full of caution. Tyrell shook his head, not looking at her. "I told him the truth. I threw everything in his face, and you know what? He had nothing to say, not a word." Sarah approached, pulling up a chair to sit next to him. The silence between them was heavy, but not one of judgment. It was one of understanding. She knew exactly what he was feeling. The same emptiness she had been carrying for years was now inside him. "Son," she began, her voice soft, "I know this must hurt, but you did what you needed to do. Now you know the truth, and as hard as it is to accept, there may not be a happy ending to this." Terrell looked at her, his eyes tired. He never wanted to believe that there wouldn't be an ending to this story. He always thought that, somehow, confronting Michael would bring some kind of closure. But Sarah was right. There was no heroic outcome. There was no reparation. She placed her hand on his, the touch warm and comforting. "What matters now is what you do from now on. Michael no longer has any power over you, and he'll never be able to ignore the truth again." Tyrell nodded slowly, trying to process what she was saying. The past was full of pain, full of lies, but perhaps for the first time, he would have the chance to decide his future. A future without the shadows of Michael Roberts, without the weight of a story he didn't write, but had to carry. "I don't know what comes next, Mom. he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. But I do know that I can't go on living in his shadow. Sarah smiled softly, her eyes full of understanding and pride. You'll find out, Tyrell. In your own way, in your own time. And I'll be here, always. He squeezed her hand, feeling a small spark of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but he had something now that he'd never had before. Control over his own story. That night, the emptiness was still there, but Tyrell knew that somehow he had taken the first step out of the shadow of the past and finally begun to build his own future. The next few days were a haze of silence in the office. The news about Michael Roberts had spread like wildfire, and now his name was whispered in the corridors, in the elevators, in discreet conversations. Tyrell realized that the world around him was beginning to change, but what mattered to him was what came next. Deep down, Tyrell already knew what he had to do. He couldn't continue working in the company of a man who had destroyed his mother's life, who had abandoned him and lived as if they had never existed. Collins Associates was not his future. Not anymore. It was part of the past, part of a story that he had finally closed. Now it was time to move on. Sitting at the kitchen table, Tyrell looked at the window. The city outside was alive, constantly moving, full of possibilities that he had never allowed himself to see before. His mother, Sarah, was beside him, as always, buttering her toast, her face calm. She didn't need to say anything. They shared the silence of someone who had been through the toughest battles. I'm leaving the company, Tyrell said suddenly, without raising his eyes from the window. Sarah paused for a second, but didn't look surprised. She just nodded. I figured you'd come to this decision. Tyrell finally turned to her. I can't go on there, Mom. It doesn't make sense. Not after everything. I've spent so long fighting to get where I am, but now I see that I was running in the wrong direction. Working for him, for me, it will always be a reminder of what he did to us. Sarah leaned forward, touching his hand gently. You don't owe him anything, Tyrell. Not to his name, not to the company. What matters is what you build from here on in. He knew she was right. For the first time in years, Tyrell felt in control. The anger that had driven him for so long, the need for revenge, had all dissolved. Now all he wanted was to build something that was his, something that wasn't tainted by the legacy of Michael Roberts. The next morning, Tyrell typed up his letter of resignation. When he handed it to the new director, there was no surprise. Things were changing too fast in the company for anyone to notice his departure. He left the building for the last time, feeling the weight being lifted from his shoulders. Outside, the sunlight hit his face, and for the first time, he took a deep breath, without the feeling that he was carrying the world on his back. The past no longer controlled him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He was free to decide for himself. Returning home that evening, Tyrell found Sarah sitting on the sofa, with a small smile, but full of pride. He sat down next to her, saying nothing for a moment. The TV was on, but neither of them was paying attention. The silence between mother and son was comfortable, a safe space. What now? Sarah asked, turning to him, her gaze full of expectation and affection. Tyrell shrugged, a slight smile on his face. Now? Now we start again. The two of them sat there together while the sound of laughter echoed from the TV, filling the air with a lightness that Tyrell hadn't felt for a long time. For once, he didn't need a perfect plan. He knew that, with Sarah by his side, he had everything he needed to move forward. The future, although uncertain, was his, and that was enough.